Give rest, O Christ, to your servant with your saints, where sorrow and pain are no more, neither sighing, but life everlasting. You only are immortal, the creator and maker of mankind, and we are mortal, formed of the earth, and to earth shall we return. For so did you ordain when you created me, saying, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. All of us go down to the dust, yet even at the grave we make our song. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. Give rest, O Christ, to your servants with your saints, where sorrow and pain are no more, neither sighing, but life everlasting. We read that prayer when we began last week, and it's so key to the theology of death and resurrection that our congregation and our tradition bring, that I might use it for the next 2 sessions too as we begin. I'm so glad that you're all here tonight, and really grateful also to have the Reverend Jennifer Allred with us. You already know, because you're here, that she serves as a chaplain at Episcopal Homes. Jennifer and I have known each other for some years now. But I don't get to see Jennifer doing what she's doing. I just hear from other people how holy her work is. So I'm really, really grateful for your leadership with us tonight. If you don't have the 3 handouts, you need one of each, and you need a pen or pencil, and I can bring it to you if you just want to raise your hand. If you're a guest with us tonight, I want you to know that if you need to use the bathroom, you just go through that door and turn left and pray, and you'll find it eventually. And I think that's probably it. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. Sorry, I thought I was on. Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you all for being here. I feel like I'm at an open mic night or something. It's just this place is very beautiful and cool, and your neighborhood is so hip. And I live in lowly St. Paul, which is not nearly so cool. I'm also not a native Minnesotan. I'm married a Minnesotan, so I tell people it means I will never leave, because you people don't leave, or if you do, you come right back. So I have planted the seed, though, because I said when I'm too old to shovel snow, we may have to talk, but we'll see how that goes. So again, my name is Jennifer, and my full-time work is at Episcopal Homes as a healthcare chaplain and a priest. And I also moonlight at HCMC as a chaplain there. I'm, for some reason in my life experience, very drawn to chaos and crisis, and I like that level 1 trauma world. It's very different ends of the spectrum in terms of people in crisis with the diagnosis, the death, the accident, the injury, and then folks who at Episcopal Homes who by and large have lived long and full lives and are older and sort of in a different season of life, and it's, they have a different relationship, I would say, to their death and their aging process. Not always, but sometimes. So it is a real honor to do the work that I do, and I never, it's funny how God works. I never sort of imagined as I embarked on divinity school and the ordination process the first time in like 2003, and then ended up in Minnesota being ordained about 5-6 years ago now. So time travels on, and here I am, and it is really an honor to be here with all of you. And I just want to say thank you for being here and for showing the courage that it takes to come and have this honest conversation and be willing to be educated about this topic of aging, of the changing and the transitions that happen to us as we get older in life, how our awareness shifts, and just kind of what it means to really look at our own mortality honestly and to become proactive about what our options are, what we would choose for ourselves, and how we want that to look. So my topic tonight that I was sort of charged with has to do with medical decision making near the end of life. And the reason that this fits, I think, for a priest and a healthcare chaplain is because you can certainly talk, and you should talk to your doctors and healthcare providers, nurses, other medical professionals who do kind of the nuts and bolts care. But the reason I think it's so important in this setting is because it really kind of is a shortcut to the heart of what we believe about who we are and kind of what our spiritual and religious commitments are, our values and our sense of meaning and purpose, and the kind of quality of life and quality of care that we hope for at the end of life. One thing I noticed, and I have had the honor to witness a lot of deaths at this point in my life, is that there are many ways that people leave this earth. There are many ways. I liken death to birth. Many of us who, I have 5-year-old twins, and many of us who have been close to birth in some kind of way, whether it was for our own children or loved ones or extended family, we make these birth plans. Have you heard of this? It's a really kind of cool, trendy thing these days. And so we're going to have a doula, we're going to have a water birth, we're going to do it in a park, it's going to happen a certain way, we're going to play a soundtrack, and everyone's going to, leave us alone or honor our boundaries or stay in the waiting room, whatever. And then it happens, right? And it usually happens in some very different way than what we maybe thought or planned or hoped for or idealized or imaged or visioned or whatever the case may be. And death is kind of the same way. A lot of us would like to live to be really old and surrounded by loved ones. Every conflict, every issue, every regret we've ever had is resolved, and angels surround us, and we die peacefully in our sleep. And sometimes that happens, but sometimes there are a lot of things that we can't control, and death is a transition just like birth that can be messy, it can be painful, it can be unexpected, it can look so many different ways. So there are things we can't control, and then there are things we can control, and that's kind of where this medical decision-making piece comes from. I have made this joke before, but I'll use it again. I love this stuff. I love to talk about questions of meaning and purpose. I love to talk about God. I love to talk about death. So I tell my friends, just be careful if you invite me to a party, because I don't really do small talk, and I love to talk about death. So you consider yourselves warned, right? But it's also true that I was raised in the South, and I feel like it's something of my birthright to be, just to love people and to love stories and conversations. And so I know how to do small talk. But if you give me a window, I will go there. And I'll be like, so what about that Healthcare Directive? And they're like, pass the cheese, So it's both. But I will, in all seriousness, start by saying that planning for your own aging process, your own illness, and eventually your own death is perhaps one of, if not among the most loving things you can do for your family or your loved ones, however you define that. And why I say that is because if I leave here and get hit by a bus on my way home, and I end up in a hospital somewhere, and I can't speak for myself, and I can't make decisions, anyone who cares about me, who's my spouse, for example, will already be overwrought and incredibly stressed and unable to think straight, and then not knowing what I would hope for, what I would wish for, what I would choose for myself in some kind of catastrophic eventuality like that would just make things so much worse for the people who are closest to me in my life and love me the most. And so I offer that as a way of you envisioning and inviting into your hearts and minds the people that are closest to you in your life, and to imagine, whether most of us don't get hit by buses, and that's a kind of extreme scenario. But anything can happen, and so having this conversation with the people who love you, and specifically with your medical power of attorney or your healthcare proxy, and we'll get into those terms in a little bit, is really, really important, because we can't plan for every eventuality. Medical talk and speak is stressful. Hospitals are stressful. And maybe some of you are physicians or nurses or work in healthcare. Maybe you have those people in your family, and so you're comfortable with that kind of talk. But under stress, you might not be. And a lot of us aren't to begin with. So it's just the kind of thing where you want your wishes to be known. It is an incredibly selfless and loving thing to look inside at your own thoughts, feelings, fears, beliefs, And then to let those things be known to those people around you who would be in the position of making decisions with you and for you in the event that you needed that. So one of the kind of, there's a certain kind of gallows humor in the hospital, I think, among chaplains that develops as partly as a way of coping, but also because there is real humor involved in life. But one of the kind of jokes that we make is that there's this thing we call the brother from California phenomenon. So let's say mom is in the hospital, has had a stroke, and can't speak for herself, and then we have maybe 2 or 3 adult children who live in town, are pretty involved in mom's care, and they kind of maybe they have or haven't had the explicit conversation about death. Maybe they do or don't have an existing healthcare directive and some things in writing. But the point is, you have this brother from California who gets on a red-eye flight and is going to be there in the morning and steps in and starts saying, "Oh no, that's not what we're going to do. I never heard mom say that. That's not okay." And all of a sudden we had these adult children in conflict with one another over what to do. So this is, it happens a lot, and it's not what mom would wish for her children, and it's not probably what she would wish for her last hours or days, or for her transition into a different level of care and a different level of cognitive capacity to look like. So again, just a kind of a good reason to have all these things as clear as you are able to make them in any given kind of moment or stage or time in your life. So I'll start with one observation, which is that American physicians, as we all know, are among the sort of best and most highly trained in the world. People come from all over the world for treatment, and they come from all over the world for medical care and medical school. And that's wonderful. We're very privileged to live in a country where we have access to such high levels of care for the most part, unequally and unfairly, of course, but it does exist here. It is an important observation that I notice that by law and by training, physicians will always treat at the highest and most aggressive level available to them. And that is, it's built into their training, it's built into the DNA of really who they are and their formation. And they're also legally bound to do so unless they have other instructions. So if you don't make your wishes known, that is what will happen, because that is what they do. So it's just worth observing that. It's also, I think, interesting and important that Medicare and Medicaid, and therefore private health insurance companies who follow their kind of standard, do not pay doctors to have conversations with patients about end-of-life care. Now, in a primary care physician, kind of family doctor situation, it might come up, but that is not billable time for them. So as things stand right now, it's a way of saying this is kind of how the medical care system is seeing this conversation about death and how it's valued or not valued, frankly. And you'll see, physicians, especially I find in certain disciplines, are eager to have this conversation and will do it anyway. But it says something to me that they are not reimbursed for these conversations. It's not considered a paid part of what they do. So by the numbers, just a couple of statistics that I've kind of find interesting and enlightening and hope that you might as well. 92% of Americans say it's important to discuss their wishes for end-of-life care. And about 32% at last count have actually had this conversation about their end-of-life care. So there's obviously a disparity there between what we believe is a good thing and then what we kind of do in terms of our actions. 95% of Americans say they'd be willing to talk about their wishes, and 53% say they'd even be relieved to have that conversation. And the block is so often that we just don't know how. I think it's so wonderful that you guys here in this community are having this series and this event, because 4 sessions is great, and you also kind of know each other's faces and names now, and you have each other to talk to and to kind of continue this conversation. I'm going to give you a whole slew of resources for anyone who's interested in doing more reading, podcasts, listening, films. We're seeing more and more good resources out there. So there are more entry points into the conversation. And then lastly, a recent study from the National Institutes of Health showed that 90% of physicians in this country would choose to forego resuscitation if facing a terminal illness. That's a really high number. So that means physicians, MDs, or in this part of the country, sometimes DOs, but highly, highly trained medical personnel who know that they are terminally ill have a standing DNR, DNI order. So DNRs do not resuscitate, DNIs do not intubate, which is another little bit more subtle thing, but being intubated for the short term, if you're young and healthy, can be a great thing. If you have terminal cancer and COPD and congestive heart failure and you get intubated, then that will create a whole new slew of questions and issues that then medical decision makers have to make on your behalf because you can't speak because you're intubated and you're in the ICU. So I don't mean to be glib, and I don't mean to be funny about things that aren't funny. This is profoundly serious, and there is also, I think, that just a very human element to it, and sometimes it is helpful to kind of see the irony, see the humor that can sometimes exist. Because you know what? Nobody gets out alive, right? We're all gonna die. So I shared with Susan, I'll share with you all, it is my style. I'm not an ideologue. I'm not sorry, I'm sliding off my stool. I must be excited. I'm not overly dogmatic, but I do have my beliefs, and I do work and live close to death a lot. And so I have my beliefs, and I believe the most responsible thing I can do is, I'm not here to evangelize, but it's to be transparent where it's appropriate about kind of what I've experienced and what I believe, and to just let you know this is what I've experienced and what I believe. It doesn't mean it's right for you. So there will be moments where I kind of admit that as a way of saying, I may have this kind of a bias, you may or may not agree, but just so you know, here's kind of where I'm coming from. So let's get down to some terms. And it's a lot to talk at you or to you even for 20 or 25 minutes. I realize that this stuff can sound very jargony, and that's kind of why I've put some of it in writing, and then some of it will be available on your Google Docs so that you can print or you can click on live links to get further information. I don't expect you to retain all of this, but I think we want to pause and take a moment to look at this pop quiz. And the reason I've brought that is because there are a lot of common misconceptions about kind of what these categories and terms mean. So let's take a few minutes. I don't care if you look on your neighbor's paper, if it's okay with them. And let's just kind of see where you land in terms of what some of these terms and questions mean before we talk further. My hope about this really is to help clarify points of confusion or questions that you may have. So we'll just kind of go through this. The first question or prompt here, hospice care is most often provided in the hospital. False. That's very, very false because, because hospitals are expensive for one thing, and because it's not where most people want to be. They'd rather be at home. So there are hospitals and there are residential hospices that people can stay in on a kind of semi-permanent basis depending on their level of need. There's also something called respite care. So once a person is qualified for hospice, they may have a spike in their level of need, or their care providers and caregivers at home or wherever assisted living or skilled nursing, wherever they are, may be just kind of maxed out and they need a bit of breathing room, and so that person will qualify for a respite stay at a residential hospice or hospital for a few days. I think it's generally every 90 days of hospice that you qualify for. And if you need more, they usually work it out with you. But so basically, though, that's false. It doesn't mean, signing on to hospice does not mean that you're moving into the hospital permanently until your next address in the next life world. Number 2, a healthcare directive is a written plan stating what healthcare treatments you would or would not want if you could not speak for yourself. That's true. And a healthcare directive is the term. Advanced care directive is another term. A healthcare directive is the term used in Minnesota. But those terms are very similar and can, in different states, they might call it an advanced care directive. But in Minnesota, it's known as a healthcare directive. Okay, palliative care. Palliative is a big fancy word, and it can kind of confuse people, especially with respect to hospice and what hospice care means. Palliative care is offered only when a patient forgoes curative treatment. False. Okay, you guys are up on this. Okay, so palliative care is a branch of medicine or an additional kind of suite of medical services and care offered to someone who has a chronic condition. It doesn't necessarily mean they're terminal or imminently terminal, but it might be cancer, it might be ALS, it might be some kind of neurodegenerative issue, or it could be any number of things, but it's a chronic condition that isn't necessarily going to be cured, but can be managed, and palliative care is about comfort and pain management, but it does not imply or necessarily mean that that death or the end of life is imminent or even near. So it's related but different. Okay, and then a POLST, which is the acronym for Physician Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment, is the same as a healthcare directive. It is not. Okay. It is not the same thing. A healthcare directive, it tends to be more narrative and descriptive, and it describes your wishes with respect to certain kinds of treatment and preferences. A POLST, and a healthcare directive, it's important to say, is not legally binding. It is not a medical order. It is not a legal contract. A POLST is a physician's order. It is legally binding. So your POLST is, and it looks, I brought some paper copies, and it will also be linked up on your documents available. It's a front and back, one-page order that must be signed by you and by a physician, and it states essentially kind of your DNR, DNI status. And it's most relevant for people who are older or who are sicker, but it can be relevant for any number of reasons. But it is legally binding, it is signed by a physician, and it is not the same thing as a healthcare directive. And then the last thing, to be eligible for the Medicare hospice benefit, which is just the formal federal name of the program, a patient's physician and the hospice medical director must determine that the patient has a terminal illness with a life expectancy of 6 months or less. So this one's actually true. It essentially means that if you qualify for hospice and all of the aggressive cares from radiation to PT are removed from your care, and you are just kind of transitioned to what we call comfort care, so things that help you breathe and be pain-free and have a good quality of life for the time you have left, that a physician reasonably expects that you could reasonably live 6 months or so-ish. It's not a perfect science. And interestingly enough, people qualify for hospice all the time, and then maybe they go off radiation and all these medications that were intended to cure them but were really, really hard on their bodies, and they start feeling better. And we kind of not joking, call it graduate from hospice. And that can happen at any point, that they come and they look at you and they say, you don't qualify anymore for hospice, and you go off. And then you can make some decisions yet again about what kinds of curative or aggressive medical cares you want or don't want to receive, and they'll reevaluate you for hospice at a later date. So hospice, I think a lot of people have this idea that you go on hospice and then you die. And it's not true, although a trend we're seeing in healthcare is that people often wait what I consider kind of too long to go on hospice, and so they don't get the benefits of the hospice services, equipment, care, quality of life, but they go on hospice, a day or two before they were already kind of in the active dying process. And so, that's really, it's okay, it's fine, it's one choice you can make, but it's kind of too late to really benefit from all that hospice has to offer. But it is a trend we're seeing in healthcare. We're seeing people come to Episcopal homes pretty much actively dying, and then they sign into hospice and they die in 2 or 3 days, and somebody says, see, hospice is deadly, it'll kill you, And it's like, well, it's not really how it works. because you do have to qualify, and a physician has to say that you reasonably could be expected to live about 6 months without further aggressive cares. And then the director of the hospice provider has to agree to that. They're not forced, in other words, to take you on as a client or patient. So they have to kind of accord with their own internal guidelines. So, okay, so that's a not a bad way into some of these jargony terms, but just the terms that I think are most important. Yeah, what's up, Jean?
I want to ask you a question about number 5.
Mm-hmm.
I have trouble with the phrase terminal illness because I do understand that it is possible to qualify for hospice even if you don't have one identifiable
Cancer or
cancer or whatever. You're going to die of old age.
yeah. So
You can't name an illness.
right. So, and this is a really fascinating thing, and I think that it's something where the medical establishment is sort of catching up. But old age, in and of itself, is not considered an illness, and it's not considered a cause of death. So, the medical examiner, whoever signs off on a death certificate, is not going to say they died because of old age, even though it's kind of obvious that it was a collection of symptoms and phenomena that happened with aging that kind of led to their death. And there used to be a category that would qualify people for hospice called failure to thrive, and they've done away with that. But they have other indicators like a certain loss of a certain amount of weight of one's body percentage, body percentage over a certain period of time is one qualifier. Cancer, dementia, some of these kinds of like categories of illness are also qualifiers. But weight loss is probably the most closely related to that kind of failure to thrive piece. And then I will also say just anecdotally that the kind of gerontologist and elder care physicians who work in skilled nursing and who work with elders are pretty good at finding a diagnosis that will qualify that person. And it's not to say that they're trying to hasten death or anything like that, but they know, I mean, when they know that someone's 95 and they have 2 or 3 co-occurring morbidities and the kind of end is in sight and they want this person to benefit from hospice, they're pretty savvy about it. So even though if you don't have cancer or dementia or something really diagnostically kind of obvious and solid to point to, they will, often the weight loss one comes up a lot, or they'll find another vascular, neurodegenerative, dementia-related diagnosis that fits. Does that help? Okay. So what's up? Sure. Hi. I'm not used to this microphone. I apologize. I just kind of breathed into it. I can and I can't. I mean, a POLST is not something that most of us who are relatively young and relatively healthy just sort of have. Because there's a middle ground for, like, if I get hit by a bus on the way home, there's a reasonable chance because of my age and whatever that I would want fairly aggressive cares, at least initially. So for me to have a standing DNR, DNI doesn't make a ton of sense at this age. If I'm 90 and I have the beginning stages of congestive heart failure, and I've seen in the ER and in the field, I've seen chest compressions on a 90-something-year-old person whose chance of really ever returning to a quality of life and health that he or she would actually want are statistically very low. For that person to have a standing DNR, DNI in their POLST, which is legally binding and on file, makes a lot more sense in my experience. The Healthcare Directive, which we're going to parse just a little bit before I go too far over time, is more narrative and more qualitative. It's going to tell it's basically an explanation for your healthcare proxy or your medical power of attorney to refer to, so that when they're faced with questions, and if you can't speak for yourself, that's going to be your decision maker. has this document to refer to and say, in this section, what's your name? Steve mentioned that his 3 favorite things are dogs, reading, and his family. And the chances of him ever returning to the ability to do those 3 things at this point, because of what we have learned about something, your brain injury or something, the doctors are telling me that's not going to happen. Therefore, I want to honor what I believe in our conversations and in this document he would most want for himself. The medical power of attorney is really important. That's the person who is speaking for you when you can't speak. The Healthcare Directive is a qualitative report of content of things about you and your beliefs and your care. And it will say, I brought some printed copies and will also be linked up, but it is a form that will name your agent, name your agent's role and any limitations to your agent's role that you might want to put in place, or expansion of that person's rights for that matter. It will also name a second alternative in case that person can't be reached or something. On a personal note, my dear husband, whom I love, is kind of a mess in a crisis. I'm very calm in a crisis. He's extremely sentimental and emotional. And I know that if something happened, catastrophic happened to me, he would really struggle to see through my wishes, which I feel pretty strongly about, removing mechanical support at certain times of a progression of an injury or illness. And we've talked about it. And so I have a second medical power of attorney that he, in this document, is asked and required to consult with, because I just feel like it's too much to ask. He says he wants that job. I mean, I was like, I could ask somebody else to do it and outsource it. But he says he wants that job. But I sort of said, this way you don't have to do it by yourself. And so that can often be a helpful thing. Or if you have a family that's kind of fractured or in conflict, and you have concerns about their ability to work together, that would be another time where you might want to think about having that second or sort of backup or second medical power of attorney person that could collaborate to make sure that your wishes do get honored. Mm-hmm. The POLST it kind of comes down to DNR, DNI status.
Do you have to have the DNR form in order to be able to check those boxes on the POLST?
You do. Well, you do, because it is a legally binding document, and because it is standardized in the state of Minnesota, and by state it is standardized. I mean, they're pretty similar state to state, but they are specific to states. So it has to be signed by you and by a physician. Yeah, but like I said, it's not always sensical for someone who's young and healthy to just sort of have a standing DNR, DNI. It just doesn't really make a ton of sense. But I think as we age or as we get some kind of diagnosis, that we know, if I get diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, Lewy body or something, or ALS or something like that, then I would definitely want to have one. Yeah, so, but there's kind of I would commend to you, I think just in the interest of time, this form. It'll give you a chance to kind of read through it and consider what kinds of things are considered kind of standard and acceptable in our state around what kinds of treatments you would or wouldn't want and under what conditions. And it'll probably raise more questions for you, and I'm certainly available to you guys, beyond this evening to talk more about any of it. But it's hard to sort of answer simply because that Healthcare Directive is intended to be more narrative and more descriptive and qualitative. At the end of the day, your healthcare proxy or your medical power of attorney, those are interchangeable terms, is the person who's going to be standing in your place, and that you want to be sure that person is very clear on what you want for yourself and is able and willing to see that through.
Jennifer?
Yes.
I get the sense you have a lot more you could tell us tonight. And I kind of get the sense that we'd like to hear it. Am I reading the room right? Rather than breaking for a small group discussion. So you've got 15 more minutes if you want it. Yeah.
Okay, well.
Is that okay?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Great.
As long as you guys are, yeah, I always feel like this sort of talking one way can get tedious, so I don't want to. Okay. Yes.
My mom was talking, we were talking about this, and she said that in the will, on her medical directive, would that be legal binding? So we wouldn't have to do another one.
To my knowledge, if it's been signed, if it's been under the care of an attorney and it has been signed, notarized, and/or witnessed, that should be adequate. Absolutely. And in the hospital on the ground, the old way used to be the next of kin, right? So that's the brother from California scenario, like some brother or ex-husband or somebody shows up and says, this is what we're going to do, you know? And I think people have sort of realized that that's kind of ridiculous, especially because families look different and relationships look different in our current social fabric. And so, and I have a lot of faith in providers. I am constantly inspired and moved by the care I see in the hospital and at Episcopal homes. But the care providers will listen to the community collected around the patient, and they'll kind of suss out, like, who is this person's best spokesperson, and kind of what are these family dynamics. We as chaplains, sometimes social workers, are often very kind of instrumental in reading that and communicating kind of to the medical care team. Because there are a lot of people who show up in the hospital with no one designated, and so you've got to figure it out. And if no one can be found and nothing can be figured out, then the medical team has to make those decisions, and they don't want to be in that situation. They don't know that person, and they'd rather not be in that situation. But yeah, they're going to look for the person who knows them best, loves them most, is closest to them, has been most involved in their care, not necessarily the most genetically closely related person. Because I don't know about you guys, but in my family, that's not the case. I mean, they're not the same thing. I mean, So I think that Healthcare Directive is really intended to solidify and put in writing conversations that you're having or have had, and hopefully can continue to revisit as your health and circumstances do change in life. It's kind of not a one and done. Ideally, it's something that you can kind of revisit with some regularity over a family meeting or a coffee or a drink, whatever it is your family does, bean bags, I don't know, but whatever helps facilitate a kind of regular check-in, I think is helpful.
So with the healthcare directive, what I would say about the kind of care I want at my age now is likely to be different from that which I will want 20 years hence.
Absolutely.
And so I should, if I'm going to make one out now, I should think, if something happens in the next 6 months, what do I want?
Right.
Not if something happens near the end when I'm 95.
Right. I mean, the challenge and sort of the needle that we're threading that can be tricky is that our health can change kind of at any time. And so the spirit sometimes is more important than the letter of what you want. And that's kind of why this Healthcare Directive document is qualitative and narrative. Because you can say, you know, it may need to be adapted in your 90s, but if I have a major stroke, let's say, or develop some kind of fast advancing dementia, my cognitive capacities can change very quickly. So there may or may not be time to sort of write all that down at 92, as I might not even be realizing that my cognitive capacities are changing quickly. So yeah, I'm 45. I want certain kinds of pretty aggressive cares at this point in my life, and I can also say, if there's evidence that I'm brain dead, I don't want to be on life-sustaining mechanical support for any period of time. I mean, even as a young person. But then, yes, of course, that's a reason I think to put it on your Outlook calendar or your Google calendar, whatever it is you have to do, set an alarm and just kind of revisit these things every so often.
One more question.
Mhm.
Relationship between the Healthcare Directive and the medical power of attorney
Mhm.
is that the medical power of attorney designates somebody who, in effect, is going to defend my healthcare directive.
I think that's a good description. Yes. So, so Jeannie's question was, when any of us appoints a medical power of attorney, that person's job is to make decisions, medical decisions for me in my place when I'm not able to speak or I'm not don't have capacity anymore. And that's something that medical people, doctors, decide if somebody has capacity or not to make their own decisions based on something like a cognitive decline from a stroke or dementia or something like that. But if you can speak and you have capacity, you can make your own decisions.